Victor followed his gaze. For her, she turned then. Her eyes widened a little, but she did not speak. The preacher cleared his throat. "You know her?" "No," Victor said. "But I am claiming her all the same." Rosalind stood. "Why?" Victor looked at her, really looked. She was thin but not weak. Her hands bore work. Her cheeks were hollow but her posture proud. She looked like someone who had survived too many winters alone. He said, "Because I know what it is to be left behind." The preacher hesitated, but Rosalind stepped forward and said, "I will marry you." They signed the license that afternoon. There was no kiss, no family, no supper. Just a dusty trail north, a wagon with supplies, and a woman in a thin wool coat beside a man who did not speak unless he had to. Victor's homestead lay 30 miles out. He had cleared most of the trees himself, built the cabin by hand. It was not much, but it held against the wind and the roof did not leak. He showed her the house without ceremony. "There is one bed," he said. "You take it, I will sleep on the cot." "I can sleep near the fire," she said. Victor shook his head. "Bed is yours." The days came hard and fast after that. Snow melted into mud and the river swelled. Victor planted oats and barley. Rosalind mended the roof, split logs, patched his shirts. She never asked why he had taken her. She never asked anything at all. But she worked every day like she meant to earn the air in her lungs. One night, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the cracks. Victor lit the lantern and found her sitting on the cot, arms wrapped around her knees. "Storms bother you?" he asked. "No," she said, "just. Sometimes I wonder if this is real." He sat across from her. "It is. Why me?" Her voice was low, not bitter. "Because no one else saw you." She looked up. "I did." They did not speak again that night, but something shifted. The next morning she made coffee and waited for him to sit before pouring his cup. Weeks passed. Spring warmed the earth. They spoke more, laughed sometimes. He showed her how to saddle a horse. She taught him how to make cornbread without burning it. One morning, while Victor was hauling stone from the creek, Rosalind came running down the trail. "There is a boy," she said, breathless. "Two of them, near the barn." Victor dropped the rope. Together they found the children, one barely walking, the other 8, maybe 9. Both were thin, covered in dust and soot. The older one stepped in front of the small one. "I am Rylan. This is my baby sister, Ruthie. Our ma and pa burned in the cabin south of here. I tried to drag her out, but he stopped." Ruthie clung to his leg. Victor knelt. "You too hungry?" Rylan nodded fast. Rosalind stepped forward and knelt beside Ruthie. "You want to come inside with me? We have stew." The girl blinked, then reached for her. That night they fed the children, washed them, and tucked them into the cot. Victor took the floor. Rosalind sat beside him, back against the wall. "They have no one," she whispered. "Then they stay," Victor said. Rosalind looked at him, eyes wide with something soft and deep. "You mean that?" "I do." She touched his hand. "You are not like other men." He looked at where her fingers rested against his. "Neither are you like other women." Days turned into weeks. Victor built a second room. Rosalind made clothes from old flour sacks. Rylan followed Victor everywhere. Ruthie called Rosalind Mama by the end of June. One evening after supper, Rosalind stood on the porch watching the sunset bleed across the hills. Victor stepped beside her. "I never thought I would find this," she said. "What?" "Peace. Belonging." Victor reached into his coat and pulled out a small silver band. "I bought this the day after we married. Did not want to give it until I was sure you would stay." Rosalind stared at the ring. "I never planned to love anyone again," Victor said. "But you brought something back I thought was gone." She turned toward him, eyes wet. "Victor." He kissed her then, gentle, sure, both of them steady in the way only people who have lost everything can be. She whispered, "I love you." "I know," he said. "I feel it every day." And when the stars broke through the sky and the children slept in the next room, Rosalind curled against him, warm and safe. Victor Ellis had claimed a bride no one wanted, but in her, he had found a woman who softened every hard trail ahead. And neither of them would ever walk alone again. The first summer rains came early, softening the earth and coaxing wildflowers from the hillsides. Victor stood knee-deep in the rye, testing the stalks between his fingers, while Rylan hunted grasshoppers with a tin pail and Ruthie napped beneath the cottonwood with a doll Rosalind had sewn from scraps. Rosalind had taken to the land with a quiet fluency that surprised even her. She moved through each day with a kind of grace that didn't need announcing, handling the livestock, tending the garden, and caring for the children as though she'd always belonged there. Some nights after the chores were done and the stove cooled, she'd sit with a piece of mending in her lap and hum tunes Victor didn't recognize. He never asked about them. It felt right not to. One afternoon, while Ruthie helped her wash linens in the creek, Rosalind called out to Victor from the bank. "She's limping," she said, nodding toward one of the cows grazing by the fence. Victor crossed the pasture, knelt beside the animal and pressed his palm along her leg. "Stone bruise," he said. "I'll wrap it tonight." Rosalind watched him a moment, then said, "You always know what to do." Victor didn't look up. "I don't, not always." Back at the house, she stood beside the porch as he washed the mud from his hands at the trough. After a long pause, she said, "Ruthie asked if she could call you Papa." Victor dried his hands on his trousers. "What did you tell her?" "I told her to wait until you were ready." He nodded once. "I'd be proud if she did." Rosalind didn't answer, but her hand found his as they walked inside. That evening, Rosalind twisted her hair back with a ribbon Rylan had found tangled in a bush. It was faded blue, frayed at one end, but it caught the lamplight when she turned her head. She baked with a rhythm, now kneading dough with the heels of her hands while Ruthie clung to her skirts and Rylan snitched bits to chew raw. Victor sat on the stoop sharpening a blade when she stepped out and leaned against the post. "I had a dream last night," she said. He kept his eyes on the edge of the steel. "What about, my brother?" "He drowned in the Missouri when I was 15. No one ever pulled him from the water." Victor looked up. "In the dream, he was older, taller than I remembered. He said to tell you I was safe now." Victor set the blade down. "You believe in that sort of thing?" "I believe in what lingers." He reached for her hand, rough fingers curling around hers. "Then I'm glad he saw where you landed." Later that week, a wagon rolled up the trail, drawn by 2 tired mules and driven by a man with a crooked hat and a ledger on his lap. He introduced himself as Mr. Haskins, sent by the county clerk to take stock of the outlying homesteads. While Victor answered questions by the corral, Rosalind brought out a cup of cold coffee and stood near enough to listen. "And your wife's name?" Haskins asked. "Rosalind Ellis." The sound of it made her breath catch. Victor didn't flinch. When Haskins had gone, she lingered by the fence, fingers trailing along the top rail. "You said it like you've always known it." He wiped sweat from his brow. "Felt true the moment I heard it." By midsummer, the rye stood knee-high and green. Rylan had taught Ruthie to skip stones, though she was more likely to drop them on her toes. Rosalind hung laundry between twin aspens, bare feet pressing into the warm soil, while Victor carved new fence posts from pine hauled down from the ridge. One cloudless evening, as moths flitted near the lantern, Rosalind pulled a folded letter from the drawer. "I never posted this," she said, offering it to Victor. "Wrote it the morning after we arrived. Meant to send it to a cousin in Helena, but I never found the words to say what you'd done." Victor unfolded the paper, eyes scanning the soft, slanted lines. "She left behind a place that never wanted her," it read, "and found a man who never asked her to prove her worth." He folded it carefully and set it on the shelf. "I didn't save you," he said. "I know," she replied. "You saw me." That was enough. They stood in silence for a long while after that. Outside, the frogs began their slow chorus and the wind stirred the grasses. Inside, the walls held all the warmth 2 people could build from nothing. Victor glanced at her. "You ever miss the town?" She shook her head. "There's nothing there I left behind." He reached for her waist, drawing her close. She leaned her head against his shoulder and whispered, "This is the only place I've ever felt like someone wanted me to stay." Victor kissed her temple, slow and steady. "Then stay for all your days." And she did. Late August brought dry heat and the kind of light that made everything feel a little older, a little worn. Dust clung to the porch rail, and the garden rows needed water twice a day to keep from curling into themselves. Victor rose earlier now, before the sun had fully tipped over the ridge, and by the time Rosalind stepped out to ring the triangle for breakfast, he'd already be back from the lower field, shirt damp with sweat. That morning she handed him a plate with cornmeal cakes and said, "There's a wagon headed to Missoula next week. I want to send for a set of readers for Rylan. He's been squinting at the old Bible, but the print's worn thin." Victor chewed slowly, then nodded. "Write out what you want." "I'll give it to Brant when he rides through." She ran her fingers along the edge of the table. "And if there's enough left from the egg sales, maybe a spool of red thread." He looked at her with a flicker of amusement. "We got plenty of brown. I've mended every seam in this house. Just once, I'd like to stitch something that didn't come from a feed sack." Victor didn't argue. He just reached for his coffee and said, "Then red it is." The next day, while Ruthie napped under a quilt Rosalind had pieced from old shirts, Rylan sat cross-legged in the dirt, sorting nails by length. Victor set aside his hammer and watched him work a while. "You ever see a sawmill run?" Victor asked. Rylan shook his head. "Just heard about them. My pa used to say machines would take the man out of everything." "Well," Victor said, "when you're older I'll take you to see one. But for now there's still plenty of work a man can do with his hands." Rylan looked up. "Will I always live here?" Victor studied him a moment. "That's for you to choose. But if you stay, there'll always be a place at the table." That evening, after supper, Rosalind stood by the washtub rinsing the last of the plates. Her sleeves were rolled, and her hair had come loose from the ribbon. Victor walked up behind her and rested a hand on her back. "Brant's wagon came through. Left this for you." He handed her a small parcel wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a thin sheaf of readers bound with twine and a spool of deep red thread. She didn't speak, but her fingers trembled slightly as she ran them over the cover of the first book. Victor leaned against the doorframe. "Figured you'd make something better with it than a bolt ever could." She turned to face him. "I wasn't used to being seen. You are now." That night, after the children had gone to bed, they sat by the hearth. She was stitching a square of muslin, the red thread moving in and out like a heartbeat. He worked slowly on a piece of leather, cutting a strap for Ruthie's new boots. She didn't look up when she said, "I used to think love had to be loud." Victor set down the knife. "And now I know it's in the quiet things, the way you remembered the thread, the way you never ask me to be anything but what I am." He didn't answer. He just reached across and took her hand, warm and calloused, and held it without needing to say more. The next few weeks passed without hurry. The harvest came in slowly, oats bundled, beans dried, squash stored in straw-lined crates. Rylan helped dig the root cellar deeper, and Ruthie toted potatoes in her apron until she fell asleep in them on the porch swing. One morning, Rosalind rode out with Victor to check the far fence. She sat the saddle steady, her skirts tucked neat under her legs. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them had long since stopped being empty. When they reached the western ridge, she dismounted and walked to the edge. Below, the valley spread wide, the river shining like a silver ribbon through the trees. She turned back to him. "I used to think I'd never belong to anything solid." Victor stepped beside her. "And now," she reached for his hand, "now I'm part of a life that holds." He didn't kiss her. He didn't need to. They stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at the hem of her dress, the horses grazing quiet behind them. When they returned home, the sun had dipped low. Rylan was chopping kindling, Ruthie chasing a chicken with her bonnet hanging off her head. Rosalind laughed, a sound that startled even her, full and unguarded. Victor watched her cross to Ruthie, lifting the girl into her arms with ease. She looked back at him once, eyes bright. The trails ahead would still be hard. Fences would break. Livestock would take sick. Snow would come heavy some winters, and the roof might leak again. But when she reached for his hand that night, her fingers threading through his beneath the quilt, he knew no road would ever feel too long again, not with her walking beside him. By mid-September, the wind shifted. It came down colder from the northern slopes, and the cottonwood leaves along the creek began to yellow at the edges. Victor nailed oilcloth over the window frames while Rosalind brought out the woolens, checking for moth holes and worn seams. The children had grown since spring. Ruthie's sleeves barely reached her wrists, and Ryland's boots pinched near the toes. One late afternoon, Victor returned from trading eggs and dried beans with a neighbor 3 miles west. He handed Rosalind a small bundle wrapped in burlap, from the Millers. Said their oldest outgrew him last fall. Inside were a pair of scuffed leather boots and a coat with a missing button. Rosalind turned the coat over in her hands. Ryland'll be proud to wear it. Victor leaned against the wall and watched her for a moment. He offered to sleep in the loft to make room if we ever take in more. She paused, eyes lifting. Did he say why? Said there's room in the house, and sometimes the world don't leave much. She folded the coat and set it aside. He's got more sense than most men twice his age. Victor said nothing, just reached for her hand and held it a while. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Rosalind sat near the hearth with a ledger open in her lap. She tapped the pencil against the page, brows drawn. There's a parcel of land due east of us, she said. Belongs to a widow named Me Corbin. She's heading back east to her sisters in Missouri. Victor looked over. You thinking what I think? She's asking $20 and a team to haul her wagon as far as Helena. Victor leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You want to buy it? I want to grow something that lasts longer than a season. He nodded slowly. We'd need to fence it before snow. I can help, she said, and Ryland can drive posts. Victor studied the firelight on her face. You planning on running the place next door to mine? She smiled, small and sure. I'm planning on building something beside you. They bought the land that week. Me Corbin came in a mule-drawn cart with her belongings stacked under a tarp. She hugged Rosalind at the fence gate, then handed over a deed folded in oilskin. Don't plant beans where I did, she said. Soil's tired there. After she left, Victor and Ryland began hauling pine rails down from the ridge. Rosalind and Ruthie cleared the brush with a hatchet and a branch hook. They worked until their hands were raw and the days shortened into long blue dusks. One evening, Victor stood at the edge of the new field, jaw tight against the chill. Rosalind came up beside him, rubbing the cold from her arms. He said, I never thought past survival. And now, he looked at the lines of the fence, the smoke rising from the chimney, the flicker of lamplight behind the window glass. Now I want more than just to make it through. Rosalind reached for his hand. Then let's build it whatever it is. He kissed her in the dark, slow and certain, the night wind curling around them. The next morning, Ryland asked if he could learn to read maps. Rosalind brought out an almanac and showed him how to trace rivers and mark elevation. Ruthie sat beside her, copying letters in the dirt with a stick. Victor watched through the window while mending the latch on the barn door. He didn't say anything, but that evening he brought in a rolled parchment and set it on the table. County Registrar drew this back when the township lines were redrawn, shows every parcel from here to the base of the Swan Range. Rosalind unrolled it, smoothing it flat. This here's ours, he nodded. And this, he tapped a spot just west of the creek, could be a spot for fruit trees come spring. She looked up. You're thinking long years. For the first time, he said, I can. That night, Victor found her sitting outside under the stars, shawl around her shoulders, ledger in her lap. He sat beside her without speaking. After a long silence, she said, I used to think I had to earn every scrap of kindness, that if I stopped moving, I'd disappear. You haven't moved in months, he said. She turned her face toward his. And I've never felt more real. He slid his arm around her and pulled her against him. Inside, the house was quiet. The fire had gone to embers and the children breathed steady in their beds. Outside, frost clung to the grass, but she was warm in his arms. They sat like that until the moon rose high, the two of them steady as fence posts against the chill, building something stronger than shelter, deeper than land. And this time, neither of them would ever be left behind. By the time October settled in, the trees beyond the eastern ridge had turned deep rust and gold. The mornings came pale and cold, and Victor's breath hung in the air when he stepped out to lead the oxen to water. Frost lined the trough each dawn now, thin as eggshell. The days shortened. The air felt tighter in the lungs. Inside, Rosalind had begun stitching heavier blankets from wool bolts traded up from Fort Benton. She worked in the quiet hours after the children had gone to bed, her fingers steady, her expression thoughtful. One night she paused mid-stitch and looked toward the fire. "I never asked what brought you here," she said. "To Clearwater, this ridge." Victor rubbed his thumb along the edge of the rocking chair arm. "My father died in a mine shaft collapse near Butte. I went east for a time, Ohio, then Illinois. Worked rails. Broke horses, nothing held." She waited, saying nothing. "I found this valley by accident, got turned around trying to reach Kalispell, camped near the creek, and when I woke, the air smelled like pine and thawed earth. It felt like the first peace I'd had in years." She watched him a long moment. "You never told me you'd been east." "I didn't want to bring any of it here," she nodded slowly. "I understand that." Victor stood and crossed to where she sat. He knelt beside her, rested his hand on her knee. "But I'm not carrying it alone anymore." She set the blanket aside and leaned forward, her forehead resting lightly against his. "You're not." The next week, the first flurries came, thin as dust, melting before they touched the porch. Rylan helped Victor stack the last of the firewood under the lean-to while Ruthie chased dry leaves with a stick. Rosalind spent the afternoon in the kitchen, slicing dried apples into a kettle of cinnamon and molasses. That evening, after the meal, Rylan carried the ledger to the table and opened it to a blank page. "I want to keep track of the harvest the way you do." Victor raised an eyebrow. "You planning to run your own land someday?" Rylan glanced at Rosalind, then back at Victor. "Maybe. But I want to learn how to keep something going, not just build it." Victor pushed the ledger toward him. "Then start with the oat count. You know the yield." As Rylan worked, Rosalind stepped outside to shake out the rug. The air bit at her knuckles, and the stars blinked between passing clouds. When she came back in, Victor was pouring warm cider into mugs. "You all right?" he asked. She hung the rug behind the stove to dry. "I'm thinking about winter. It's different when you're not alone." He set a mug in front of her. "It'll be long. But we've got enough food, plenty of wood, and each other." She turned to him. "Do you ever think about what comes after all this?" "You mean years from now?" She nodded. "I think about you with gray in your hair, telling Ruthie's children's stories by the fire while I try to fix a gate that doesn't need fixing." She laughed, surprised. "That's the first time you've said anything about growing old." "I never pictured it before," he said. "Not until you." That night, once the house had gone quiet and the coals dimmed, he reached for her hand in the dark. "Rosalind." She shifted closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm here." He kissed her shoulder, then rested his head beside hers. "I want to give you a proper wedding come spring. A gathering, food, a circle of hands around us." She turned, her forehead brushing his. "You already gave me more than I ever thought I'd have." "I want to stand beside you with the whole valley watching," he said. "Not because I need to prove it, but because you deserve to be known." She cupped his cheek with her hand, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "Then in the spring we'll stand together." The winter settled in steady. Snow came deep and sure, burying the fence posts and blanketing the land in silence. Rylan learned to set traps with Victor. Ruthie helped Rosalind stir tallow into soap molds. The days slowed, but they held. On the first warm afternoon of May, after the last snow melted from the northern slope, Rosalind stood in the patch of wildflowers just beyond the barn. Her hair was braided with small sprigs of sweetgrass. Ruthie danced around her in a dress newly stitched from pale blue muslin. Victor waited near the old cottonwood, dressed in his cleanest shirt, his boots polished with bare grease. Rylan stood beside him, taller than he'd been last fall, holding a small wooden box he'd carved himself. There were no strangers. Only neighbors and kin by choice, gathered in a ring around the couple. The The preacher from Clearwater came, carrying the same book he'd used the day Victor married her in silence. This time, the words were spoken clear. Victor took Rosalind's hands in his. "You were the first peace I found after years of dust and noise. You are my place." She looked into his eyes, steady and certain. "You saw me when no one else did, and you stayed. That's the love I'll carry every day." The preacher asked if they would live in honesty and strength, and they both answered yes. Rylan opened the box, and Victor slipped a new silver band onto her finger. She pressed a kiss to his palm before lacing her fingers with his. There was food and laughter and a fiddle brought down from the mountains. Ruthie fell asleep beneath a quilt in the grass, her head in Rylan's lap. Rosalind sat beside Victor on the porch, her hand resting on his thigh. He leaned close. "You tired?" "No," she said. "Just full." "Of what?" She looked toward the field, now green with new oats. "Of everything I never thought I'd have." They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. Years passed. The orchard grew.